Michael, it's great to speak to you. You've been in print journalism for over 25 years, but it was 155 years ago that the first sports report was printed in a newspaper. So what I want to know is, since that great day in 1862, how have football reports changed in newspapers?
Well, I don't go that far back, although I've got to be honest, it does feel like it. My knees are creaking away. No, I've been doing it for, like you say, since 1986 when I started, wrote my first football report. It's changed an awful lot. I mean, I don't go that far back, but how it was all very functional in the beginning. I think there was no TV football. There was very little. Well, there was radio football, but people got their information from newspapers, and they kind of trusted their newspapers, I suspect, a lot more than they do now. So newspapers would send one, maybe two people along, and would run very long match reports, just literally telling you what happened, with very little of the flowery stuff that we see these days. Because you didn't know, you'd not seen it on the telly, you'd not, I presume, you heard much on the radio. Certainly not like now, where we 10 matches a weekend to watch and listen to. So I think people wanted to know every aspect of the game. I don't know how tactically, how much they went into it tactically. Whether it was literally, talking about how this pass, that pass, and this was the score. There was a very famous, because just to show you how bad communications were, there was a very famous event where England played America somewhere. I can't remember where it was, in a World Cup in something like 1950, and England lost 1-0. But when the report, when it was filed to the office, the guy who picked the result up thought it must be wrong, and they filed it, England won 10-0.
Disaster.
Yeah, but England had in fact lost. So, I mean, as communication improved for everybody that's interested in football, newspapers have had to adapt. So every little change. So when it first got on TV, they would have had to think, well, that match has now been seen by everybody on TV, and we need to up our game a little bit. But certainly, I can remember from the sort of 70s when I used to read. Not much. I used to read newspapers, and I used to like looking at the pictures. I was a kid, I was a teenager. Again, there was very little TV football. I don't remember. The only games I can remember watching on TV were the cup final and maybe some European Cup finals. So whereas you can't imagine that, there was very little. And I remember the first live televised Premier League game was a big event, a massive event. I think Spurs played in it against Forest, and I was in hospital at the time. And everybody was crowded around in a ward. It was like a really big thing. And now you can't get away from it, can you? But so, really, newspapers have had to adapt, not because they wanted to, but because technology meant they had to find a different way of keeping people's interest. So it evolved with better pictures, because I think people still love to look at an image of a great goal. They might keep it. I certainly used to cut out.
Yeah, sure, in magazines, yeah.
And in newspapers, I would cut stuff out. And when Arsenal won, I'm an Arsenal supporter, and when they won the Littlewoods Cup in 1987, I think it was, against Liverpool, I was working. And I spent the next day fairly hungover and cutting out pictures of Charlie Nicholas from a newspaper and mounting them on the wall, because I had no access to pictures, just like other people. But sorry, I leapt ahead there. So I think that the first big change would have been when I think newspapers would send two people to a match, one person to write the report, another person to start getting quotes from managers and players, and you had amazing access back in the day. So that was the first really big change, where you might get a match report and then you'd get some quotes from whoever would speak to you, and that became the norm. And then I think there were a whole, so I'm talking maybe, I can't come to it from before that, but maybe in the 80s, I certainly was taught to write 3 or 4 paragraphs giving people a rough view of what had happened, and then go loads of quotes. Even though sometimes the quotes were inane, I've never been a big fan of it, because managers and players, they learned to not say what they really thought, because they said what they really thought, they get done by the FA. So it became an exercise in futility, where you'd be trying to get something good out of them. They didn't want to say anything because they get in trouble. and now they all have media training. So there was a sort of a clumsy area in the end of the 80s, and then in the 90s we had full colour newspapers evolved. I did the first ever full colour picture.
Is that right?
On a sports page in the Evening Standard, a spread. What we call a spread. So the paper used to have a certain amount of colour pages, and the rest had to be black and white. And you obviously, if you needed two colour pages next to each other, and then you thought, well, maybe I can make the picture run across both sides of this report, and that had never been done in the Standard before. So I did that for the first time, and then with that became, well, we can make it look nicer, so we need to make it read better. So we would try and you'd see newspapers would try and do graphics to it, even though, again, I think I've always thought it was incredibly futile, because you've seen it on the telly. I want to see a load of arrows pointing. I don't think it works very well in newspapers myself, but newspapers are obsessed with it. But they added graphics to it. They added columnists, try and get managers to write columns for you, trying to get players, ex-players, anybody you can get to give you exclusive content. And so the pages just got more and more complicated, and more elements from the football reporters. So the poor reporter would not just go anymore just to write a match report. He would have to get, and maybe there's only one guy to have a match report, a quotes piece, a think piece for the next day's newspaper. You're not just going there and watching a game. And I mean, in the Evening Standard, there came a point where we have a TV station and the internet, and one guy might go get there, do a piece for the TV, a piece for the internet, a piece for the paper, a piece for this. I don't know whether he's coming or going at the end of it. It's a lot of work. You wouldn't understand, I guess. You wouldn't imagine. Not you wouldn't understand. You wouldn't believe the work that goes in.
I mean, you mentioned TV and how, the Evening Standard once had some TV and internet, but now there's a new medium. There's technology. There's Arsenal Fan TV. It's now got more subscribers, dare I say, than many local newspapers will get readers per issue. Do you think that newspaper companies are creating websites to combat this new technology?
I don't think so. I think newspapers still will have their expert view of really skilled writers. See, it's one thing to watch it; it's another thing to write it and keep your interest up. And there are some brilliant writers there you'll think, how have they ever come up with that as a report? Is brilliant, and that's something that Arsenal Fan TV can't match, and we wouldn't take them on to match that. Where newspapers are broadening out is with the internet, because the internet. So there was a point at which, if you had a great story, you didn't put it on the internet, because then everybody got it. You would wait, and some newspapers, particularly the Sun and the Mirror, would, if they had a great story, would put out a spoiler first edition where it had a really dull back page lead on it, because they had a brilliant story that they didn't want to go in the other newspaper. And I saw it with my own eyes. We weren't allowed to. I used to work for the Sun, and you wouldn't be allowed to leave. If you'd finished your shift, you wouldn't be allowed to leave with the early edition newspaper, in case that you went outside and phoned up the Daily Mirror and told them this is what's got here. But now, instead of keeping stuff back, and all reporters, I used to keep stuff back. Now newspapers work. They have an internet site working in tandem with the print side, and you just get it up on your website first, because it's an exclusive, whatever it is. If you found out. We're speaking on the day Tony Pulis got sacked by West Brom. So if you were the first reporter, local, presumably somebody in West Brom would have got that first. Get it up on your website first. It's still a thing. All journalists are competing to be the first.
Well, there's lots of journalists out there. Last week I spoke to the Moose from TalkSport. He told me that he thinks radio is the best medium in the world. So as a print journalist employed by a newspaper, how would you respond to that comment?
Well, he's a big lad, the Moose, isn't he?
He is.
I wouldn't want to upset him. But I've got a lot of great memories of listening to the radio. I, as a young man, every Saturday afternoon, I would sit in my bedroom, listen to LBC or 5 Live or whatever it was called then, and wait for news of my team scoring. I loved the radio. I think that I'm not here. I wouldn't. They're not comparable. I think the Moose is just
Yeah, it's
he's just running the party line
fair
there
enough comment.
from TalkSport. They're very different. They've all got things to offer. Obviously, the best thing about radio is that it's quick and you get your goals quicker. That's why Sky have done the Jeff Stelling program, effectively a radio program, because they're trying to give you the information first. But if you're out and about, you can't compete with the Moose. But our boys can write rings around anybody at TalkSport.
Now, nowadays, the younger generations, they're not reading newspapers as much. The FA, the Premier League, they're trying to encourage education whilst, obviously promoting football at the same time. Do you think that newspapers have the obligation to start encouraging children to read the back pages instead of listening to football reports on the radio or watching highlights on Match of the Day or the internet?
Well, it's not an obligation. It's an absolute necessity, or we'll all be out of a job. But I don't think it's a fight we can win. I've got kids who wouldn't pick up a newspaper if they had a gun held to their head. Wouldn't pick up a book. So you young people are obsessed with images and phones, and you want everything there and now. The biggest problem that you, as a generation, youngsters face is that I don't know if enough people understand what is trustworthy. What is, Donald Trump will tell you everything's fake news. In fact, it's not fake news. And if you go to the wrong source, Wikipedia is not to be trusted. It's a starting point, but people can get onto Wikipedia and fiddle around with it, and it's not trusted. And newspapers, although of course they have their political leanings, and you may, certain newspapers are definitely pushing their own agenda. There'll be newspapers who don't like immigrants, newspapers, but they are. There is a starting point of the reporter has tried to get to the truth. I wouldn't say that's probably that doesn't. It's very difficult to explain, but the Mail, the Daily Mail, push an agenda that their editor Paul Dacre once pushed. So if you don't know that that's the spin that maybe has been put on something, then that's dangerous as well. But I think newspapers, you need to get information from newspapers, then cross-check it by all means. But the problem with just using the internet to look up stuff, and you get your goals. I mean, I was showing my daughter around a university when Arsenal went 1-0 up on Saturday against Tottenham, and within 5 minutes I was able to see the goal on Twitter from somebody I follow on Twitter. That's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable.
So there's a lot to enjoy and a lot to be thrilled with, but by the internet. But there's an awful lot of traps out there that people could fall into.
Do you see newspapers being a part of the future of football reporting?
Long term, no. I think unless your generation wake up and smell the coffee, print newspapers will disappear. Already, so my company also owned the Independent, and they closed the print version of the Independent last year or the year before, I can't remember. And it's still an internet site, but it's not the same as the newspaper, which was a phenomenal newspaper with incredible amount of love and effort went into it, but nobody read it. And so it became unprofitable. I think I work for a newspaper that's got a chance because although we are free, we have a massive readership in London, so we don't get any money from selling it, but we get money in from advertising. But that money is on the decline. Advertisers want to go onto the internet, and I think the generation of people coming up now are moving away from print newspapers, and it does worry me. I'm 52 now, and I feel when I hear about people of your age going to do degree courses in print journalism, I feel a bit sad and a bit worried for those kids. I just hope I'm wrong, because because you need newspapers. There will be if newspapers disappear tomorrow, in 20 years' time, people like Donald Trump will come on and say that they had the biggest inauguration ceremony ever, and there'll be no one to question it. And that is the job. It should be the main job of print newspapers, is to question everything, to hold people to account. It doesn't always happen like this. I'm fully aware of that. But if you don't have that check and balance in their councils, local papers, keeping an eye on councils, then we're all going to get we're all going to be disappointed somewhere down the line.
Michael, you've been great. Thank you so much for speaking to me. Thanks very much.